Thank you, Dean Cooper, for your kind introduction, and thank you all of you for coming out this evening. One day, someone at Keysight Village, one of the communities I'll be telling you about tonight, got a bad case of food poisoning. They sent an email out to the Keysight Village listserv, writing that they couldn't keep water down or even stand up without vomiting. They asked if someone could fix them a cup of broth and indicated where in the fridge they kept their jar of broth base. Within minutes, another community member had written that although they were out, they should be back and able to check in on the person in question within the hour. A short while later, however, someone else wrote to say that they'd already prepared the broth and that the person in question was resting. Someone else then wrote to suggest that soda crackers would probably be a good idea, and within minutes, yet another person had written to say that they had gone to pick some up. This incident is typical of how life unfolds at Keysight Village. The other community I'll be telling you about this evening is Konkan Mori in Tokyo. And an experience I had there captured something similar to what I've just described about Keysight Village. At the end of a long, hot summer at Cancun Mori, I fell very ill. On the day before my flight back to uLethbridge, one of the families prepared lunch for me, complete with my favorite fish. When I got back to uLethbridge, I received the following reply to my thank you note. And this is in Japanese English. The writer correctly felt that my Japanese was not up to the task, but I'm sure you'll get the point. About the lunch I cooked when you were sick, I'm feeling that was the collective houseness. For example, we live at a normal apartment, and you live at the next room of mine. I say, "Are you okay?" You say, "I feel sick." Maybe I don't say, "Shall I cook the lunch for you?" If I say so, you will say, "No, thank you, I'm okay." In the collective house, he concluded, we are closer than neighbors. What I'd like to do this evening is talk about how communities like Konkan Mori and Keysight Village can help us expand how we approach the topic of happiness and well-being. And I'd like to just say before I begin that terms like, definitions of terms like happiness, well-being, flourishing, the good life, and so on are vague and varied, and there's a whole constellation of both objective and subjective approaches to those topics. And since it's especially difficult to figure out what those terms mean when we're looking cross-culturally or when we're looking across time, I'm just going to use the terms very loosely and interchangeably throughout my talk tonight. Now, although the concern with happiness and well-being has deep roots in a number of philosophical and religious traditions, we're currently engaged in a renewed interest in the topic, which has become increasingly salient in policymaking circles, in academia, and in popular culture. The beginning of this renewed interest can be dated to Bhutan's introduction in the early 1970s of a gross national happiness indicator, which was designed to challenge and replace the narrowly economic gross domestic product as an adequate measure of prosperity and well-being. Since that time, here we go. Since that time, we seem to have become increasingly obsessed with happiness. There are, for instance, new academic subdisciplines like positive psychology and happiness economics that are devoted exclusively to its study. In addition, a number of countries have started taking well-being and happiness into account in their policymaking processes. And even the United Nations has gotten involved by directly encouraging member states to attend to well-being in their policymaking processes by releasing a World Happiness Report, which just came out a couple days ago, and by instituting an International Day of Happiness, which was March 20th, just 2 days ago. And finally, as you're all no doubt aware, there's been a proliferation of self-help literatures and techniques designed to help people achieve happiness. So happiness and well-being are a big deal these days. Now, I want to frame the research I'm going to tell you about tonight by suggesting that there's a problem with this trend. And that is that much of the research being done on happiness and most of our efforts to achieve it are focused almost exclusively on the individual, which is where we tend to locate happiness in terms of its root causes as well as its manifestations. This captures only part of the picture, however, and what I'd like to do is suggest how we might approach getting a sense of the bigger picture. That's the title of my talk, Locating Happiness Beyond Individualism. So let me begin by talking about individualism for a few minutes. Most of the current literature on happiness, both academic and popular, builds on the approach of positive psychology, which was developed in the late 1990s on the basis of the claim that psychology as a discipline had suffered from an overemphasis on what is wrong, things like mental illness, crisis, and distress, and an underemphasis on what is right, things like strengths, capacities, and positive emotions. One result of this orientation is the idea that we should focus on enhancing the positive instead of fighting the negative. And the key method for doing this is work on the self by means of therapy, meditation, and various tools for developing positive thoughts, all with the goal of producing a positive attitude, which is itself considered a form of happiness. So one of the key defining features of positive psychology is that it focuses on what happens inside people's heads. And given its emphasis on the positive, it constructs happiness as having to do with emotional satisfaction and positive affect. In other words, with the presence of good feelings and the absence of bad feelings. Although this makes intuitive sense, it's not without its problems. First of all, it turns happiness into an attitude that we each need to cultivate individually, that we have a responsibility even for cultivating. And this sense of responsibility that many of us now feel feeds a multi-billion-dollar happiness industry that profits from our consumption of a range of self-help programs and techniques of well-being, including various kinds of therapy, as I've just mentioned, diet and exercise regimes, runaway antidepressant usage, since now sadness has been constructed as problematic, if not even abnormal, and even plastic surgery. In a way, happiness itself has become a consumer item. In addition, this narrow focus on our internal selves also means that we're paying less attention to what goes on outside of people's heads, to things like economic systems, political systems, employment and healthcare systems, larger demographic trends, and the state of community and what goes on between people. In a way, the idea of human welfare, which is an expansive concept that can only really be imagined and put into practice in the context of a very clear social whole, has been replaced by the concept of well-being, a frame that focuses narrowly on individual selves. This narrowing of focus dovetails with neoliberal or market-based approaches to social organization. These approaches claim that if markets are freed from state interventions and if individuals are accordingly liberated to be their naturally autonomous and entrepreneurial selves, the result will be a healthy economy and happy, self-fulfilled individuals. And there's a correlation between the type of person most valued in positive psychology and the type of person most valued in neoliberalism. That is, someone who is self-examining, self-governing, active, autonomous, and self-sufficient. The goal here, then, is to encourage self-governance instead of state government. And in this framework, responsibility for happiness, just like the responsibility for poverty and risk more generally, is devolved to the level of the individual. In keeping with this, some happiness economists have suggested that governments can use measures of subjective well-being to determine who to target with programs designed to increase resilience, and that this will have the beneficial side effect of allowing for cuts to welfare programs. And in some contexts, and I'm thinking here in particular of the US and the UK, benefits for poor people have been cut and the money rechanneled into therapy programs like cognitive behavioral therapy, as if there are no structural problems, only problems of attitude. Now, there's nothing wrong with work on the self. I do plenty of it, just like many people I know. But while focusing on ourselves as individuals and on cultivating positive emotions may seem pretty obvious, these ideas are in fact quite unique, both historically and cross-culturally. And this brings me to the second set of problems with too narrow a focus on individuals. Although it has deeper roots, the kind of taken-for-granted emphasis that we today place on our inner lives actually emerged in Western culture in full form only around the time of the European Enlightenment, so around mid-17th century. So strange as it may sound, the way in which we now think about ourselves as persons and our focus on our personal thoughts and emotions separate from what's going on outside of us is not timeless, but is actually pretty new. The idea that happiness is an individual right or responsibility is also new. If you go back to ancient Greece, happiness is something that happens to you by means of the whims of the gods, and is less about a subjective state than an evaluation of life as a whole, usually after it's over. Indeed, the root of the word happiness, happenstance, points to sheer dumb luck. In addition to this, when we look at other cultures, we find that not all societies place emphasis on the individual in the way in which we do, or on emotional satisfaction and positive affect. Different cultures value a range of different emotions, including some of those classified as negative and even destructive by positive psychology. Whoops. So I have not been putting up my slides, have I? Okay, here we go. I'm very sorry. I got carried away. All right. So, for instance, in terms of cross-cultural variation, among the Yapese in Micronesia, happiness and contentment, or falfalan, is seen as negative, insofar as people who are falfalan are considered to be focused only on their own success and comfort, to the neglect of a focus on the well-being of other people's success or comfort. Indeed, gafgao, or suffering for others, is what is most highly valued. Among the Japanese, zaiakukan, something similar to our concept of guilt, is a sign of virtue, since it points to the need to attend to the impact of our behavior on others. Among the Curaçao, Sierra Leone, kendeye, or well-being, refers to social well-being rather than to individual physical or psychological health. If you put these examples together, you can see that while we think independence is a great thing, there are plenty of cultures in which independence and individualism are frowned upon or even feared, and in which dependence and relationality are more highly valued. In anthropology, we categorize those societies as sociocentric as opposed to egocentric. And referring back to our own culture, in recent years, there's been increasing recognition that a narrow focus on our inner lives captures only part of the picture. The Harvard study of adult development, for instance, which has followed over 2,000 people over its 80-odd years, has come to the conclusion that relationship and community are the key to happiness. Thus, the current director, Robert Waldinger, has stated that loneliness kills. It's as powerful as smoking or alcoholism. Other psychologists have started pointing to the fraying of human bonds and the declining indicators of well-being that have accompanied the heightened individualism of the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. According to the 2016 census, the number of one-person households in Canada surpasses all other types of living situations. So about 30% of people in Canada live by themselves, more than couples with or without children, single-parent households, or intergenerational households. And according to the 2010 and 2012 national surveys of lifestyle in Japan, loneliness is the key determinant of well-being, not gender, not age, not income or educational level or occupation. Given this, it's good to know that some indexes of happiness, and in particular the Happy Planet Index and the UN World Happiness Report, which just came out a couple days ago, focus not only on what's called subjective well-being, but also include measures of things like income inequality and ecological footprint, pointing to the larger context of subjective well-being. And from a completely different arena, Ontario and BC courts recently ruled that solitary confinement is unconstitutional. So there's increasing recognition, although I'd argue that it's still along the margins, of the larger context of well-being. And what I'd like to do for the rest of my time this evening is focus on one aspect of that, and that is connection, which will bring me back to Keysight Village and Konkan Mori. As an anthropologist acutely aware of the uniqueness of our society's contemporary focus on the individual, I became interested in models that locate happiness and well-being not only inside individuals' heads, but also in social relations, since what goes on inside people's heads is profoundly socially influenced. Interestingly, neuroscientists are starting to agree with anthropologists on this point. In a new book called How Emotions Are Made, neuroscientist Lisa Barrett argues that emotions are not as universal as we may think, but that they're substantially learned and shaped by culture and so variable across history and across societies. This makes sense given that much of how we are oriented in the world and much of our behavior is the result of teaching and learning rather than of instinct. This is why people are so different in different cultures and why the way people think and act in Lethbridge right now is different from how they thought and acted 100 years ago and how they will think and act 100 years from now. So it might be useful to locate well-being in the social as well as in the individual and to think about what models there might be for how to do this. One model, and the one that I want to focus on, is provided by intentional communities. You've all no doubt heard about these types of communities, some forms of which have been around for ages and which today take the form of eco-villages and spiritual communities, which are the most common and perhaps have the deepest history, hippie communes, which still exist, like the farm in Tennessee, although a number of them have morphed into eco-villages, kibbutzim, senior communities, disability communities, and so on. In the end, I decided to focus on a type of intentional community that has been understudied despite its increasing popularity, and that is urban collective housing communities. These communities are unique because, first of all, they're geographically integrated with society at large, in contrast to, for example, eco-villages and many spiritual communities which tend to be geographically removed from mainstream society, often on purpose. They're also deliberately cross-generational, in contrast to retirement communities. And finally, they make space for the private and the individual as well as the collective, in contrast to some religious communities and eco-villages. So they represent forms of utopic practice that articulate claims about what is wrong with society and a desire for something better while remaining fundamentally engaged with the society around them. In other words, they don't cut themselves off. And they organize their lives in a way that challenges radical individualism without being exclusively collectivist in orientation. So they don't just go to the opposite end of the spectrum. In addition to these unique features, excuse me, I also thought it would be interesting to compare how these communities operate in different societies. And so I chose one community in Canada, which has traditionally been individualistic in orientation, and one in Japan, which has historically been collectivist in orientation. And I also chose Canada and Japan because they're located neither in Europe nor in the US, which are considered the centers of intentional community development, because I wanted to see what happens along the margins. So let me tell you about Keysight Village and Konkan Mori. Konkan Mori and Keysight Village are the first purpose-built urban collective housing communities in their cities. Konkan Mori occupies 2 floors of a 12-story building and has 36 people living in 28 units. So this is, whoops, excuse me. How do I use the pointer again? Is it this one? This one, okay, all right. So this is me just arriving at Konkan Mori. And Konkan Mori occupies the 2 floors of a 12-story building here. Keysight Village has 29 people living in 19 units. Did I already say that Konkan Mori has 36 people living in 28 units? Okay, thank you. Keysight Village is about to celebrate its 20th anniversary, and Konkan Mori is in its 15th year. By purpose-built, I mean that in both cases, a group of people got together with the idea of creating a community and hired an architect to help them design spaces that would encourage social interaction among residents. So Keysight Village, for instance, all the unit doors open onto walkways surrounding a common outdoor courtyard, so they're all facing inwards. The result in both communities is a built environment that provides residents with their own private apartments, complete with bathroom and kitchen, but that also have a range of common spaces, a common kitchen and dining area, gardens, a common laundry room, and play areas for children. So this is the first floor layout of Keysight Village, and here's the inner courtyard, and you can see that the apartments are kind of in a horseshoe shape around the courtyard. This is the common area, this is the common meeting and dining area, the common kitchen, common laundry room, a play area for children. This is an office that is rented by a midwife who also lives at Keysight Village, and there's the guest room. The layout of Konkan Mori is quite similar, so again you have all the units in a kind of horseshoe shape facing towards the common areas, the dining room and meeting area, the common kitchen, a library and play area for kids. There's a patio here where there's tables for eating when it's nice out and growing flowers. There's the common laundry room, another kids area, and here is the community garden. And just to show you what this looks like, here is the common kitchen at Keysight Village, the courtyard at Keysight Village. This is the dome room. So when Keysight bought the property, one of the buildings that was on the property had a dome. And so when they built Keysight Village, they decided to kind of honor that and carry that tradition forward. And so they built a dome room. This is up on the 3rd floor, and you've got great views of Vancouver City there. People use the dome room for meditation, for yoga, for practicing music, if they want to work on a project, read, be by themselves. If they want to have a smaller meeting, they don't want to use the common room for that. Kids can use it for sleepovers, so on and so forth. This is the common kitchen at Konkan Mori. They have a professional grade kitchen. Here is the eating and meeting area, and you can see through the sliding doors that there's a patio out there where, again, they eat there when it's nice out. Kids run around. And so the next photo is not the best, but so you're in this area looking towards the kitchen. So this was designed so that the ceiling goes up to the bottom of the 2nd floor, so that when people come out of their 2nd floor apartments, they're immediately oriented to the common space. And people will often open the windows here and stick their heads in and yell down and talk to the people who are down there. So in both cases, you can see that there are shared spaces that people use and that it's organized to, it's built in such a way as to encourage that kind of shared that kind of interaction. Okay, whoops, I didn't want to go there yet. So the way the environment is built and this encouragement of interaction is designed specifically to try to alleviate social isolation by creating spaces in which people can be both independent and hang out with other people. And I'll get back to this point later. Another feature of both communities is that they're self-governing, and all decisions about community issues, such as garden usage, community expenditures, and social events, are made collectively. So this is a photo of the monthly community meeting at Konkan Mori, and here is a community meeting at Keysight Village. Yet another feature of Keysight Village and Cancun Mori is that they're deliberately cross-generational. Both actively recruit families, and at one point, Konkan Mori decided it didn't have enough kids, and so they decided to give a discount to people who came with children. So this is a slide of Yutaka-san. Yutaka-san is the oldest member of Konkan Mori. He's some 80 years old, and he's feeding Tomu-chan, who at the time was the youngest member of Konkan Mori. And this is a photo of Carol McCormick, a founding member of Keysight Village. Also, she just turned 80 last year, and she's holding the baby of a family that came to join Common Meal. Finally, both Keysight Village and Konkan Mori work to address economic and environmental issues by means of pooling, for example, bulk buying and gardening and shared laundry facilities. All of these features are captured in their official guiding philosophies. The philosophies are quite similar, so I'm going to just mostly draw from Konkan Mori's. So first, there are 3 core intentions that inform their community: to share space and time with others, to have independent and private space as well as communal space, and to spend time together in common activities. There are also a number of additional principles. Everyone needs to cherish their own independent life as well as sharing. Everyone from single people to large families can enjoy Konkan Mori. Living at Konkan Mori needs to be both practical and ecological. Life needs to be open to the outside world, and there needs to be a focus on communication and diversity. We need to grow and learn from each other. Just last week, Keysight Village just approved an updated value statement that in many ways mirrors Konkan Mori's additional principles, and they highlight in particular environmental stewardship, trust, communication, camaraderie, and community engagement. So with that background in mind, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what life is like at Keysight Village and about the people who live there. Without exception, residents' decisions to join Keysight Village in Konkan Mori stemmed from what they saw as a loosening of social cohesion and community ties. As a result, they found themselves living far away from their extended families, isolated from their neighbors, and in general, increasingly lonely. So there was a strong desire for social connection. There was also concern with the environmental impacts of single-family living, of everyone having their own house, their apartment, their own car, their own washing machine, their own lawnmower, and so on and so forth. So there's an emphasis, as I noted a moment ago, on sharing resources. At Keysight Village, this concern with the environmental impacts of single-family dwelling and of just dwelling in general extends to elaborate composting and recycling systems designed to bring the community as close as possible to producing zero waste. So this is a photo of Brian, one of the founding members of Keysight Village, working in the compost area. And this is their recycling center in their basement. And I just want to draw your attention to the blue garbage can in the bottom right of this photo. There are 30 people living in this community. And there are 4 of these blue garbage cans, and they only get picked up once every 2 weeks. So they do so much composting and recycling that sometimes these 4 garbage cans are not even full when they're collected. Okay, so residents of both communities see their communities as a form of intervention. A number of Konkan Mori residents see Konkan Mori as an explicit policy-relevant effort to address problems generated by post-war social fragmentation, such as childcare shortages and increases in domestic violence, as well as the issues associated with the rapidly aging population. Some also see their community as an antidote to recent redefinitions of ikigai, which translates as the good life or what makes life worth living. So redefinitions of ikigai in which commitments to work and extended family began to be seen as less important than privacy, individualism, and consumerism. Residents at Keysight Village express similar desires and concerns. In both communities, residents place particular value on common spaces, not only the kitchen and eating areas, but also the common play areas for children in the garden and other outdoor spaces. Many have said that they especially enjoy preparing common meals and participating in special community events. They like always having somebody that they can eat, drink, or just hang out with. Parents, for their part, speak highly of the benefits of having other parents to go to for advice, of having other adults available to pick up the slack in the event of an emergency, and of having peers for their children to play with in a safe environment. And older people talk about how refreshing and fun it is to have little kids around. Most generally, everybody appreciates being in a situation that allows them to simultaneously participate in collective living and maintain privacy and independence. So what I want to do now is go through 5 features of life in these communities that I think capture something essential about them. And I just want to point out before I begin that I'm only about halfway through this project, so a good 50% of my data have yet to even be looked at, let alone analyzed. But I think these are still on the right track. So as you might expect, in both communities, interaction among residents is intense. There's constant interaction in common spaces, endless social events, helping events, taking care of the community events, and lots of interaction on listservs. So just to show you what this looks like, this is a photo of Linda, the woman on the right, on your left, who is a founding member of Keysight Village, with Julie, who's one of the more recent members of Keysight Village, and they're checking on the carrot crop, which is in the garden that runs along the front of the building. And this is Linda checking on the vegetable garden at the side of the building. This is Konkan Mori's community garden. The woman in white is Wada-san and her 2 children. The older one, Taria-chan, and the younger one, Amelie-chan, were born at Konkan Mori, so they have lived in this housing collective for their whole lives. And Fujita-san in the back recently moved out, but she lived at Konkan Mori for about 6 years. Konkan Mori also has a workshop area, and this is a group of people at Konkan Mori building planter boxes for the flower garden. And the 2 women in the back, the woman in red, Sakamoto-san, and the woman in green, Ura-san, are long-term members of Konkan Mori. Sakamoto-san was one of the original planners of Konkan Mori, and both of them have been absolutely pivotal in making this project a possibility. At New Year's in Japan, people eat mochi, which is a pounded rice treat. And so Konkan Mori has its own mochi-making equipment, and every year they have their own mochi-making party. They also, by the way, make their own miso. This is a couple people at Konkan Mori preparing a common meal. And here people are eating a common meal. This is actually quite a staged photograph, and usually things are a little bit more relaxed looking than this. This is a common meal at Keysight Village, complete with, where am I, anthropologist and son. My son has visited me at both research sites. This is Thanksgiving at Keysight Village. So before the dinner, but after they've already started drinking their wine, everybody holds hands and sings a song and gives thanks. In the summer at Keysight Village, instead of having a common meal, and the common meals are usually prepared by 1 or 2 people, people kind of come and go in the summer, so there's every Monday night there is a potluck common meal in the patio if the weather is nice. This is a spring picnic at Konkan Mori. This is a birthday party at Keysight Village, complete with dancing, and I don't know if you can see the bubbles. The little girl in front is playing with bubbles. And this is a post-common meal party at Konkan Mori. So at Konkan Mori, after regular common meal, often, especially if the common meal is on weekends, a smaller group will gather afterwards. They'll bring out more food, they'll bring out more alcohol, and they'll hang out till the wee hours of the morning. And here, Nakatagawa-san is playing music for our entertainment. I had the pleasure of being at this particular event. Her youngest son is sitting on the lap of a visitor. And this stuff, I forget what it's called, doesn't look so great, but it's actually quite delicious. What I don't have photos of is all the things that people do outside of the community together, like going out to eat together, or to the movies, going to art exhibits and performances, engaging in demonstrations and other political activities, going to the recycle depot, so on and so forth. So joint activities are not confined to the physical boundaries of the community. I need to point out, though, and this is crucial, that these are not communities in which people have no privacy and in which social interaction is obligatory. There's some quite private people living in both Konkan Mori and Keysight Village, and different members engage socially to different degrees at different times. So this intensity of interaction is organic and naturally occurring rather than forced. The second noteworthy feature of these communities is their diversity. Both Keysight Village and Konkan Mori work to recreate what were traditionally family ties or extended family ties, but, and this is the key, in altered form, since in both cases diversity of age, background, profession, and religious or spiritual orientation are considered keystones. So although there's a shared philosophy of collective living, no one's interested in living in a community of people just like themselves. As one person at Konkan Mori put it, the community is interested in creating bonds not based on blood. And the way someone else put it is like this: we're neither friends nor family, but something different, something new. So this isn't just about nostalgia, it isn't just an attempt to go back in time, but it's also, or perhaps more so, about grafting ideas of past ways of living that were less isolating with contemporary realities and aspirations. The third pattern, which I pointed to earlier, is that this something different, something new, reflects an explicit desire to balance interdependence and independence. The goal of Keysight Village and Konkan Mori residents is not to participate in community simply in order to boost one's personal level of happiness. So it's not about getting at the self via the detour of the other. That's the slide I have in the bottom of the person reaching out into the world, but eventually just aiming back at themselves. This is a slight but significant difference between how community is thought of in these contexts and how positive psychology sometimes pitches community involvement. In places like Keysight Village and Konkan Mori, the goal is to build a healthy community with a capital C. That is, the community, as one resident put it, is a basic characteristic of humanity. So you don't do volunteer work or community work only to feel good, but because it needs to be done. That's just what it means to be human. Feeling good may be a wonderful side effect, but it's not the main purpose. And you don't invest in relationships in an instrumentalist way, but engage in them because connection, again, is a basic characteristic of humanity. Ikuko Koyabe, an architect and scholar heavily involved in the development of Konkan Mori, told me that while collective communities need to start at the level of the individual, since they're, after all, comprised of individuals, And although the production of individual well-being is clearly important, this is only ever accomplished by means of engagement in community, by learning how to live with difference and how to communicate. This community with a capital C, though, is not about reducing or eliminating the autonomy or integrity of the individual. Instead, the two are seen as inextricably tied, as part and parcel of each other. So to quote Ikuko Kayabe again, instead of getting more material goods and services for an individual family, we thought we should open up our lives. We might be able to make a place to relax, but at the same time keep our privacy if we shared time, information, or place. The fourth pattern is that in addition to, or as part of this something different, something new, a number of residents' stories reveal a relationship between moving into collective housing and reevaluations of life as a whole that entailed criticisms of the idea of happiness as something exclusively personal or individual. Some residents changed jobs and reassessed friendships with people who were overly focused on individual achievement and acquisition. Others altered the relative weighting of various activities in their lives, devoting more time to being with others and spending less time on their own or on seeking material goods and personal advancement. These rethinkings and reconfigurations reflected their ongoing efforts to create a mutually beneficial harmonization of the personal and the collective, neither of which would trump the other, as I pointed out a moment ago. So the point here is that living in a collective housing community changes people. It's not just a place to live, but a way of life. Fifth, and finally, none of this means that these are completely harmonious environments. As someone once said to me, you are not in paradise. Residents' participation in community endeavors waxes and wanes, and everyone struggles to navigate the relationship between what they see as community and what they consider to be private and personal. Residents sometimes experience difficulties in balancing their lives in Keysight Village and Konkan Mori with their lives outside the community, and in balancing their private lives in the community with their participation in the collective aspects of their communities. And there definitely are conflicts and resentments aplenty, as you can imagine. But despite these struggles, residents claim that the benefits of living in collective community far outweigh any inconveniences that might come along with it. The price to pay of not being completely self-focused was minimal compared to the benefits and joys of living with others. As one resident put it, it's more fun to live with more people. Now, before concluding, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the differences between Keysight Village and Konkan Mori. As I said earlier, one of the reasons I've chosen to work in these specific communities is that they're located in very different kinds of societies. Keysight Village is located in a society that has traditionally emphasized the individual, while Konkan Mori is located in a society that has historically emphasized collectivity. So not surprisingly, although they share the same philosophy, there are some significant differences in how these philosophies play out. So I want to tell you about just a few of these differences. The first has to do with space. Although space is arranged in somewhat similar ways in each community, it's used differently. In Konkan Mori, there's a much sharper distinction between personal and public space relative to Keysight Village, where the boundaries are much more fluid. Keysight residents visit each other's private spaces regularly for dinner, coffee, to borrow things, or to have meetings. The latter sometimes when residents, well, not have meetings, the latter sometimes when residents aren't even home. They don't have meetings when other people aren't home. But the story I wanted to tell was that once when I was helping to prepare a common meal and ran out of olive oil, I was told to go into the apartment of somebody who wasn't home to fetch it. And so they gave me instructions. They said, go into the kitchen. When you're facing the stove, the olive oil will be on the cabinet to the left. When I stay at Keysight Village, I often stay with Kathy McGrenera, who's one of the founding members. She's a hub of the community, and her apartment is centrally located on the bottom floor near the common space. And the last time I was there, to my great surprise, I was just sitting at the table doing some work, and somebody walked in and used the bathroom and then left. So they were on their way out of Keysight Village, and they decided they needed to use the bathroom, so they went to use the common bathroom, and somebody was using it, so they just came in and used the bathroom and then left. Now, these are somewhat extreme examples, and this kind of thing certainly wouldn't happen in just any of the apartments at Keysight Village, but it definitely would never happen at Konkan Mori. People don't often visit each other's apartments at Konkan Mori, but instead tend to restrict their interactions with others to the common spaces. Indeed, if you remember the slide I showed you of the people building the planter boxes, the two women, Sakamoto-san and Ura-san, who've lived there the longest, have never been inside of each other's apartments. This is a difference in use of space that may seem quite minor to us, but it's a little difference that really matters in terms of the experience of collective living, and that I think is tied to some general cultural differences between Japan and Canada in terms of how people negotiate space and social relations. My second example has to do with decision making. You'll have noticed from my slides of community meetings that things seem much more formal at Konkan Mori than they do at Keysight Village. And you can even see see the dog sitting on, the dog was part of the meeting. Okay. So this is obviously a difference in how space gets used. But it's also the case that the way decisions are made in these two communities is very different. It unfolds very differently. At Keysight Village, airing personal feelings and expressing conflict are seen as good things, however difficult they may be. So stuff is put out on the table and people can talk through it and come to some kind of compromise. And this fits in with the cultural system in which suppressing emotions is generally viewed as unhealthy. This is not at all the case in Konkan Mori, where airing strong personal feelings and conflict is not considered to be useful or to the benefit of the community. The focus rather is on harmony, on following protocol, and on the good of the community as a whole, which can be sabotaged by conflict and the expression of strong emotion. My last example has to do with governance. You'll remember I said earlier that both communities are self-governing. So both Keysight Village and Konkan Mori have a series of committees that deal with different aspects of collective life. But again, this looks very different at Konkan Mori than at Keysight Village. At Konkan Mori, there are some 22 committees. Remember, there's less than 40 people living there. There are some 22 committees, and everybody is obligated to sit on 2 of those committees. And everybody is also obligated to participate in preparing a common meal once a month. In contrast, at Keysight Village, there are only 6 committees, and residents aren't obliged, but invited to participate. And the same goes for common meals. And while some residents at Konkan Mori have a hard time imagining how things would unfold in a situation of what looks like a complete lack of structure and no obligation, residents at Keysight Village have a hard time imagining how they would deal with what they see as the more rigid structure of Konkan Mori. And again, these are differences that reflect cultural differences. So I don't want you to walk away this evening thinking that there's only one way that people do collective living. Regardless of the models that they share, these kinds of communities will all look differently on the ground as the models are adapted to local cultural contingencies. So I'd like to conclude by summarizing what I've been learning so far from working with people at Konkan Mori and Keysight Village. In both cases, a group of people decided that living by themselves or in nuclear families in isolated apartments or houses was inadequate. They felt they wanted something more, some kind of connection with others that was more regular and more intimate than what they had gotten from participation in community centers, religious organizations, or educational groups. They wanted to live with others, and they wanted to live with others in a way that allowed them to enhance the sharing of resources and reduce burdens on the environment. So they got together and, with the help of architects, designed places to live that would make this possible. Places where everyone had their own space, but where there were also shared spaces. Places where they collectively made decisions about how to organize the shared aspects of their lives. Places where they had privacy, but also a group of others that they could depend on when in need and also just have fun with. Places where there were a range of different and interesting types of people to interact with. The residents of Keysight Village and Konkan Mori already know what some public health researchers have started to demonstrate in studies of intentional communities, and that is that people who live in these communities benefit from better health, both physical and psychological. So these kinds of studies work to relocate well-being in a set of social relations. The residents of Keysight Village and Konkan Mori have taken this idea of community seriously enough to make it the basis of their everyday lives. They don't participate in community, they are communities. Konkan Mori and Keysight Village therefore provide us with an approach to living that challenges the individualistic ways we've tended to think about well-being, and that therefore broadens our perspective. And they don't challenge this individualistic approach by being completely collectivist, but instead by recognizing that happiness and well-being and the good life are both individual and collective. So they tell us that it doesn't really make sense to think about happiness and well-being as either one or the other, but as both. This is a simple, straightforward argument, and I'm probably stating the obvious to many of you here tonight, but it's an insight that is only now starting to make serious inroads into policymaking, into academia, and it's lagging way behind in popular culture. And even in academia and policymaking circles, we have a long way to go before we recognize both sides of the coin in a balanced way. So what I'm hoping is that places like Konkan Mori and Keysight Village become more widely visible, and that people in general and policymakers in particular recognize their value as one potential solution to isolation among the elderly, alienation among youth, limited access to economic resources, and the fallout of environmental degradation. To repeat what one Konkan Mori resident said, it's more fun to live with more people. And this is a photo of Carol, who I showed earlier holding the baby, with a couple Keysight Village residents and also a couple Konkan Mori residents. What I haven't told you about tonight is that part of this project involved bringing people from Keysight Village to Konkan Mori and some people from Konkan Mori to Keysight Village, and I'm happy to talk about that later if you like. Places like Keysight Village and Konkan Mori thus expand what one anthropologist refers to as our toolkit for thinking about happiness and well-being. The point here is not to push this particular model of living, but to underscore the importance of relocating happiness in a landscape that includes but is not limited to what goes on inside people's heads. And to claim that the more examples and models that we explore, the wider our lens, the better. The more we can learn and the more we can experiment. This can only be beneficial to how we think about and practice happiness. Before turning to the question portion of this lecture, I'd just like to say a couple thank yous. I'd like to thank the organizers of the Public Professor Program for inviting me to participate in what has become a marvelous series. I'd like to thank the Social Science and Research Humanities Council for funding this project. I'd like to thank Jenny Oseen and Hector McIntyre, without whose help in dealing with the hideous forms involved, I never would have gotten the funding in the first place. I'd like to thank Jake Vinge and Chelsea Whitting, who have been fabulous research assistants. And finally, I'd like to thank the photographers who've contributed their work to this project: Michiko Matsumoto, Yoshi Sakamoto, Chris Dimmer, Julie Conlin, Danya Metzger, Marilee Stevenson, Connie Blundy, and Don Gill. Thank you very much.